a black doctor, exhausted from a grueling 12-hour shift at the hospital, finally boards his flight, ready to return home for the first time in weeks. But the moment he steps into the first-class cabin, everything changes. A flight attendant eyes him suspiciously, her expression tightening as she scans his boarding pass one too many times. Then, without warning, she questions whether his seat belongs to him. The murmurs start immediately. Other passengers glance over, some with curiosity, others with quiet judgment. He tries to explain, calmly, professionally, but she's already called for security. Just 5 minutes later, the situation escalates. He is humiliated in front of everyone, forced to provide proof of a ticket he had rightfully purchased. And then, just when he thinks the worst is over, a powerful voice interrupts the tension, leaving everyone in stunned silence. What happens next? No one saw it coming. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we begin, comment below and let us know where you're watching from. And if you believe stories like this need to be told, don't forget to subscribe for more. This all started on what should have been just another ordinary day. The first-class lounge was a study in quiet indulgence. The air smelled of old money, aged scotch, imported leather, expensive perfumes that lingered too long in the air. It was the kind of silence that was not empty but full. Full of unspoken rules, full of the quiet confidence of people who had never been told they did not belong. Cassandra Reynolds sat alone near the window, turning the pages of a well-worn book. She was not the sort to announce her presence. She did not wear wealth like a badge, did not need to drape herself in gold to justify her seat among the privileged. She had bought her ticket like everyone else. And yet, Margaret Langford entered the lounge with the air of a woman accustomed to deference. She did not walk, she floated, her presence marked by the sharp click of designer heels, the shimmer of diamonds carefully curated for maximum effect. She had been here before. She had never had to wonder if she belonged. And then, she saw Cassandra. A pause, a calculation, the kind of hesitation that was imperceptible to those who had never been on the receiving end of it. Margaret's lips curled into a smile, though there was no warmth in it. She leaned toward the woman beside her, her voice pitched just loud enough. Is first class open to just anyone these days? The words fell lightly, almost lazily, like a match dropped onto dry earth. A hush spread through the lounge. Not the silence of ignorance, but of permission. People heard, but no one intervened. That, too, was an unspoken rule. Cassandra did not react, did not look up, did not give the woman the satisfaction of acknowledgement. Instead, she turned another page of her book. The movement deliberate. It was not a submission. It was something far more dangerous. It was indifference. Margaret's smile faltered. This was not how the game was played. Cassandra was supposed to shrink, to explain herself, to offer some justification for her presence in this world that Margaret had long considered her own. The lounge remained silent, waiting. Cassandra did nothing but read. And so, the game began. Margaret Langford was not used to being ignored. Silence, in her world, was a form of power, a means of dismissal, a declaration that someone was beneath acknowledgement. But here, now, the silence belonged to Cassandra Reynolds, and Margaret found herself rattled by it. She shifted in her seat, crossed her legs with practiced elegance, and let out a soft chuckle, as if laughing at a private joke. But the joke, she realized, was on her. Cassandra had not asked to be part of this performance, had not sought Margaret's approval or her disdain. And that, more than anything, made Margaret bristle. She turned again to her companion, a woman draped in silk and social status, and let her voice carry just enough. These days, everyone thinks they're entitled to luxury, no matter how little class they have. A sharper blade this time. The words laced with the practiced ease of someone who had long mastered the art of the insult disguised as observation. Around them, the lounge had grown still. Not out of concern, but curiosity. This was a game they had seen before. A ritual, almost. There was a rhythm to these things. A balance that had to be maintained. Cassandra turned a page, her expression unchanged. And yet, the silence had shifted. It was no longer indifference. It was something else, something deliberate. Margaret felt it now, A sensation she did not recognize but instinctively disliked. A lack of control. She reached for her champagne flute, the crystal cool against her fingers, and took a slow sip, waiting for Cassandra to react, to break. But the woman across from her did nothing. She did not shrink. She did not fight. Margaret exhaled through her nose. The problem with people like Cassandra Reynolds was that they did not play by the rules. They did not engage in the way one expected. And that was dangerous. Margaret had made a statement, and Cassandra had refused to acknowledge it. And so, the question became, what happens when someone accustomed to holding power suddenly finds themselves powerless? Margaret intended to find out. Margaret Langford was growing impatient. The game had not gone as planned. Cassandra Reynolds had not risen to the bait, had not flinched, had not allowed herself to be diminished by Margaret's carefully sharpened words. And that, more than the presence of a woman like Cassandra in a place like this, was what Margaret could not abide. Margaret was used to controlling the unspoken rules of spaces like these. She knew how power was asserted, how it was reaffirmed in small ways, a glance, a shift in tone, a question posed in just the right way to suggest, without ever outright saying, "You do not belong here." She had assumed Cassandra would do what people like her were expected to do. Look down, look away, shrink into the periphery. But Cassandra simply turned another page in her book. Margaret let out a soft sigh, shaking her head as if in pity. She leaned forward, making a performance of examining Cassandra's attire. Jeans, a blazer, a book that had clearly been read more than once. Not the polished uniform of the elite. Not the kind of conspicuous wealth that reassured people like Margaret that they were among their own. First class used to mean something. Margaret mused aloud, her voice just loud enough to be heard. This time, Cassandra did not ignore her. She looked up, finally, and for the first time. Their eyes met. Margaret expected anger, defensiveness, something she could use, something she could dismiss. But what she saw instead was something far worse. Amusement. Cassandra tilted her head slightly, as if Margaret were a child throwing a tantrum in the middle of a store. Her lips parted, and she let out a quiet, knowing chuckle. Margaret's grip tightened around her champagne glass. "You think I'm funny?" she asked. Her voice sharp now, the practiced ease slipping. Cassandra's smile didn't fade, but there was no warmth in it. "I think it's interesting," she said simply. Margaret blinked, unsure of how to respond. The rules of engagement had been broken. The moment should have ended with Cassandra backing down, offering an apology for a crime she had never committed. But instead, she sat there, looking at Margaret as though she were the one being examined, as though she were the one whose presence needed to be justified. Margaret's pulse quickened. She had spent a lifetime mastering this game. But now, for the first time, she wondered if she was losing. And if she was losing, then the question was, to whom? Because if people like Cassandra Reynolds could sit here, unbothered, unmoved, unwilling to be put in their place, then what did that mean for people like Margaret Langford? Margaret set down her glass with a quiet clink. This was not over, not yet. The lounge had not changed. But the air had. It was the same polished leather seats. The same hushed murmurs of business deals and weekend getaways. The same carefully constructed world of those who had never been questioned. And yet, something had shifted. Margaret Langford felt it in the way her fingers tightened around the stem of her champagne glass. She had built her life on the certainty that people like Cassandra Reynolds knew when to step aside, knew when to apologize for taking up space. And yet, Cassandra sat there, unmoved, unreadable, turning the pages of a book with the same quiet confidence that Margaret had always mistaken for weakness. Margaret was not used to feeling powerless. She was used to the world bending around her. The way doors opened without effort. The way her presence was met with eager smiles. Careful attention. That was how it had always been. Until now. Margaret set down her glass and leaned forward slightly. If words wouldn't move her, perhaps something else would. She rose to her feet, smoothing the silk of her dress, and strode toward the first-class check-in counter with a deliberate grace. The attendant, a young woman with a polished demeanor, smiled at her approach. "I'd like to confirm that I'm seated in first class," Margaret said. her voice light, pleasant. I just want to make sure there haven't been any mix-ups. She did not turn to look at Cassandra. She did not need to. The implication was already in the air. The attendant blinked, briefly caught off guard. Of course. Ma'am, may I have your boarding pass? Margaret handed it over, waiting, letting the moment stretch, letting it fill the space between them. She wanted Cassandra to feel it. To feel the weight of being doubted. Of having her presence questioned in a place where others moved freely. The attendant nodded. Everything is in order. Ms. Langford, your seat is confirmed. Margaret offered a gracious smile. Oh, wonderful. And what about her? And there it was. The attendant hesitated this time, glancing toward Cassandra, who still had not moved. But now, she was watching. Margaret could feel the shift again. The attention in the room narrowing. Focusing. Her seat is also confirmed. The attendant said finally, her voice carefully neutral. Cassandra finally moved, slowly, deliberately, closing her book and setting it aside. She looked at Margaret with an expression that was impossible to define. A mixture of amusement, understanding, and something deeper, something older. You're really committed to this, aren't you? Cassandra said. Margaret tilted her head slightly. I'm just ensuring standards are upheld. Cassandra let out a quiet laugh. Not cruel, not bitter, but something close to pity. You think class is about where you sit on a plane? Margaret's lips parted, but she said nothing. You're standing here, Cassandra continued, her voice soft but unwavering. Dressed in your finest, clutching your ticket like a shield. Trying to prove something to yourself. And the truth is, you're the only one here who's afraid you don't belong. The silence that followed was thick. Unrelenting. Margaret felt it press against her. Heavy in a way that no diamond, no designer dress, no bank account could lighten. The attendant cleared her throat softly. Is there anything else I can help you with? Ms. Langford? Margaret forced a smile, shaking her head. No, that will be all. She turned sharply, returning to her seat. But she did not sit as comfortably as before. Because for the first time, she wondered if Cassandra Reynolds was not the one who had been out of place all along. Perhaps it was Margaret. The thing about power is that it rarely announces itself outright. It does not need to. It moves in the spaces between words. In glances exchanged. In the unspoken agreements between those who have always known the comfort of belonging. Margaret Langford had spent her life mastering those spaces. She knew exactly how to wield a pause. A sigh. A carefully placed question to remind others where they stood. But today, here, in this first-class lounge, something had gone terribly wrong. Cassandra Reynolds had refused to shrink. Margaret could feel it now. That unease. That creeping realization that the rules she had relied on were not working. Not in the way they always had. And so, as the call for first-class boarding echoed through the lounge, Margaret made her final move. She stepped toward the gate just as Cassandra approached, falling into step beside her. To the outside observer, it would have seemed like an accident. Just two passengers moving toward their seats. But it was not an accident. I suppose you must fly often, Margaret said, her voice light, conversational. Cassandra glanced at her, eyebrows raised. Why do you suppose that? Margaret smiled, tilting her head slightly. Oh, no reason. It's just rare to see someone so comfortable in spaces like these. She let the words settle, waiting for them to do their work. Cassandra exhaled through her nose, almost as if she were laughing. Spaces like these. She repeated the phrase slowly, as if rolling it around in her mouth, tasting it. And what kind of space is this? Exactly? Margaret's lips curled. Exclusive. They reached the boarding gate, handed over their tickets. The agent smiled at Cassandra, returned her boarding pass without hesitation. Margaret watched closely, waiting for a flicker of doubt, for a question, for even the smallest moment of hesitation. But there was none. They stepped onto the jet bridge. And now the space between them felt different. Not like before. You know, Cassandra said suddenly, adjusting her bag on her shoulder. I used to think people like you were protecting something. That all this, the looks, the comments, the testing, was about keeping first class special. Margaret turned her head slightly, curious despite herself. And now? Cassandra met her gaze directly. And Margaret felt something in her stomach twist. Now I know you're not protecting first class at all. Cassandra's voice was smooth, steady. You're protecting yourself. Margaret opened her mouth. But Cassandra kept going. Because if I can be here, if I can belong without needing your permission, then what does that mean for you? The words landed between them. Undeniable. For the first time, Margaret felt the weight of a question she did not have an answer for. The first-class cabin was quiet, wrapped in that particular hush of privilege. The sound of fine crystal clinking softly, the rustle of expensive newspapers being folded with precision, the murmured conversations of people accustomed to moving through the world without interruption. Margaret Langford took her seat with the composure of someone who had always known this was where she belonged. She smoothed the fabric of her dress, adjusted the gold bracelet on her wrist, and exhaled slowly. She had won, or at least, she had not lost. Cassandra Reynolds, however, was directly across from her, sinking into her seat with the ease of someone who did not need to prove anything to anyone. That, more than anything, made Margaret's throat tighten. The flight attendant approached with a practiced smile. Champagne, ma'am? Margaret nodded. The attendant turned to Cassandra. And for you? Cassandra returned the smile. Effortless. Just a glass of water. Thanks. Margaret scoffed softly, just enough for Cassandra to hear. No taste for the finer things? Cassandra turned her head, eyebrows lifting slightly. You think class is about what's in my glass? Margaret tilted her chin, watching Cassandra carefully. Class is about knowing where you stand. Cassandra chuckled. It was not a harsh laugh, nor a cruel one. It was something softer, something knowing. And yet, here we are, same seat, same flight, same service. Cassandra leaned back. So tell me, Margaret, where exactly do you stand? Margaret's fingers tightened around the delicate stem of her champagne flute. This was not how the conversation was supposed to go. She had expected Cassandra to be defensive, to try to explain herself, to insist on her place in this cabin with all the righteous indignation of someone who knew the odds were against her. That would have been easier. That would have allowed Margaret to slip back into the comfort of her assumptions. But Cassandra was not angry. She was calm, and worse, she was patient. Margaret had spent her life believing in a kind of balance, a natural order in which people knew their place. She had thought that she was the one enforcing the rules. But what if she had only ever been following them? What if all of this, the quiet power of first-class lounges, the subtle dismissals, the whispered questions of belonging, was not the natural order at all? What if it was only a performance? And what if Cassandra Reynolds had decided, today, that she simply would not participate? The flight attendant reappeared, placing the drinks before them. Margaret looked down at her champagne. But suddenly, it tasted bitter. The hum of the airplane filled the cabin, steady and relentless, like the undercurrent of something waiting to break. Margaret Langford sat stiffly, staring at the bubbles rising in her untouched champagne, feeling, for the first time in years, uncertain. Cassandra Reynolds had not argued with her. She had not raised her voice, had not played into the familiar rhythm of confrontation. And that, more than any impassioned speech, more than any righteous fury, was what rattled Margaret the most. Because Margaret had built her life on knowing how to win. But how do you win a game when the other person refuses to play? Across from her, Cassandra exhaled lightly, her fingers tracing the rim of her water glass. She was unbothered, untouched. She was not looking for Margaret's approval. And that was dangerous. Margaret cleared her throat, her voice cutting into the thick silence. You don't seem particularly grateful to be here. Cassandra raised an eyebrow. Grateful? Yes. Margaret straightened her shoulders. Not everyone gets to experience first class. Cassandra tilted her head slightly, as if studying Margaret, as if peeling back the layers of what had just been said. And tell me, Cassandra murmured, who exactly am I supposed to be grateful to? The words landed like a slow, deliberate knife. Margaret's mouth opened, then closed, because she had meant something, of course. But now, forced to examine it under the weight of Cassandra's gaze, she realized she could not name exactly what it was. Grateful to whom? Cassandra repeated, her voice smooth but firm. Margaret swallowed. To the airline? Cassandra continued. To the passengers in this cabin? Or maybe to you? Margaret shifted in her seat. Cassandra leaned forward slightly, her voice quiet but unshakable. I paid for my seat. Just like you. I walked through the same gate. Just like you. So tell me, Margaret, why should I be grateful? When you've never had to be. The words settled into the space between them. Heavy, undeniable. Margaret felt something rise in her chest. Something like indignation but tangled with something else. Something more dangerous. Fear. Because the truth, spoken plainly, was a difficult thing to run from. She had spent her whole life believing that certain things did not need to be said. That power did not need to be named to be felt. But now, here was Cassandra, holding up a mirror Margaret had never wanted to look into. And the reflection was not flattering. Margaret inhaled sharply, reaching for her champagne, but her fingers trembled against the glass. For the first time in her life, she was beginning to understand something she had spent years trying not to see. And she did not like it. Margaret Langford had always believed in order. It was not something she had ever needed to name, because it had always existed around her, like the air she breathed. The right people in the right places. The right names on the right lists. A world that made sense because it was arranged as it should be. And yet, here she was, in first class, in a seat she had occupied countless times before. And for the first time, she felt entirely out of place. Cassandra Reynolds had not moved. She had not raised her voice. She had not argued. And still, she had dismantled something Margaret had spent a lifetime constructing. The flight attendant reappeared, collecting the untouched glasses from their trays. Margaret's champagne was warm now. Forgotten. Its celebratory purpose long lost. Is there anything else I can get for you? Ma'am? The attendant asked. Her voice professional, smooth. Margaret hesitated. She had spent this entire flight trying to re-establish something. Control. Authority. The right to decide who belonged where. And now, as she looked at the flight attendant, at Cassandra, at the silent passengers who had witnessed every exchange, she realized something horrifying. No one cared. No one was waiting for her next move. No one was expecting her to win. And if no one was expecting her to win, then perhaps she had already lost. No, Margaret said at last, her voice quieter than she intended. The flight attendant nodded and moved on. Cassandra exhaled softly, tilting her head as she watched Margaret. You look tired. Margaret bristled. I am not tired. Aren't you? Cassandra asked. And there was no cruelty in the question. Only curiosity. It takes a lot of energy to hold onto something that was never really yours. Margaret stiffened. And what exactly am I holding onto? She shot back. Cassandra shrugged. You tell me. Margaret wanted to argue. She wanted to insist that Cassandra was wrong. That everything Margaret had said and done had been justified. That she had not overstepped or assumed or imposed. But the words would not come. Because for the first time, Margaret did not know if they were true. The plane began its descent. The hum of the engines shifted. The pressure in the cabin thickening. The moment was slipping away. Being buried under the mechanics of landing. Of movement. Of the next thing. Margaret glanced out the window. Watching the city lights rise to meet them. She inhaled deeply, but it did not steady her. Because the truth was this. She had been right about one thing. First class did mean something. It was never just about the price of the ticket. Or the quality of the service. It was about who got to move through the world with ease. And who had to justify their presence every step of the way. Margaret had spent this flight trying to remind Cassandra Reynolds of her place. But in the end, it was Margaret who had been reminded of hers. And now, she would have to live with it.